The young woman who gave the statuette to Tatarsky has been arrested and appears to be cooperating, at least to some extent, with the Russian law enforcement authorities. She comes from an activist background. She attended anti-war rallies in St. Petersburg in February 2022. She belongs, as does her husband, by the way, who is in the West, where he went to avoid the conscription, the mobilization. Anyway, they both belong to a party which has previously provided support to the Russian dissident politician and blogger Alexei Navalny. There's no reason to doubt at all that she has strong, or has had strong, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western, anti-Putin sympathies. Of that, I don't think there's any doubt at all. But there is serious questions and very great doubts about what her exact role in this murder actually was. And it seems that she agreed, or so she says, to work for a group of people whom she took to be Ukrainian journalists, and they employed her apparently as a courier, amongst other things, and according to what appears to be her account, she delivered this parcel to Mr. Tatarsky, without knowing what it contained, in which case I would say, by the way, she is completely innocent of any crime. Now, I have to say that that is her account, and it is important to not to second guess it at this stage. Let me reiterate, anybody charged with any kind of criminal offence must be presumed innocent until they're proved guilty. And on balance, I have to say, I find her account a plausible one. It's not inconceivable, perhaps, that she did know what she was doing, but it's also, I think, hardly implausible that she was used by whoever it was who was responsible for carrying out this murder. Now, the Western media is full of speculations that this was an internal feud within the Russian political system. Tatarsky is said to be close to Prigozhin, and Prigozhin has had a difficult relationship, to put it mildly, with the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and the Daily Telegraph, for example. One of its reporters, Roland Oliphant, is making some really, I think, quite extraordinary claims that the Russian Defense Ministry might have murdered Tatarsky as some kind of a warning to Prigozhin. I find that an absolutely fantastical idea. I have to say, I haven't seen a scintilla of evidence to support it. I think it is almost certainly, in fact, I'm absolutely sure that it is completely wrong to the point of being absurd. I think that certainly at a time like this, at a time of war, the Russian Ministry of Defense is not going to be organizing the assassination of people who are close to one of Russia's most important commanders, if one can call Prigozhin a commander. At least he certainly plays a pivotal role in the operations of the Wagner Group. I can't imagine that the Russian Defense Ministry would be doing anything of that kind. And for the record, I can't recall an instance when it's been proved that the Russian Ministry of Defense has ever at any time acted in that way. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the US essentially confirmed that the murder of Daria Dugina, the daughter of Alexander Dugin, the Russian intellectual and philosopher and Eurasianist, who was murdered, Daria Dugina was murdered in Moscow, that murder was the work of Ukraine's special services. So Ukraine, according to the United States, has done this sort of thing. And I can't help but think that they must be the obvious suspect. The Russian law enforcement authorities say that they are. And though, as I said, at this stage, this is still only in investigation, that must be the operating hypothesis. I do find it extraordinary. I do find it absolutely bizarre at this present time that Western journalists, Western reporters, Western commentators, seeing incidents like this, seeing incidents like the Tatarsky killing, instead of straightforwardly condemning it, condemning the murder of a man, maybe not, a man who is uninvolved in the war, but anyway, the murder of a man in a peaceful city, in a cafe, with large numbers of civilians around, some of whom were injured as a result of a bomb, that Western reporters and commentators, instead of condemning this act, or at least criticizing this act, come up with speculations about it, far-fetched speculations about it, trying to distance Ukraine from it. Speculations, as I said, which are unfounded on any conceivable evidence, and say things about the murdered man, that he was a propagandist and a blogger, and pointing to his previous criminal record, which he undoubtedly did have, at a moment of this kind. I mean, I find that very, very strange. I get to choose my words extremely carefully at this point. And I would say that perhaps the people who write in this way should take a step back and think about what they're doing. After all, I would point out that when murders are committed in Western capitals, which Western journalists attribute to the Russians, Litvinenko, Skripal spring to mind, well, their approach, their commentary about those murders is very different. And that you can, if you want, focus on differences between those murders and Tatarsky's. I personally think that's a pointless exercise and a mistaken approach to take. Anyway, this murder of Tatarsky and the way it's been covered, and I should say, for me personally, it is the way it's been covered that is the most troubling aspect of this affair. The way it's been covered in the West is also consistent with another incident which has gathered extensive media headlines. And this is the events at the Pechorsky Lavra in Kiev. It's one of the major religious centers of Orthodoxy in this part of the world. And of course, as many people have been, and I'm sure all of you, my viewers are aware, the Ukrainian government has been trying to gain control of this building, expelling the Orthodox monks who have been based there. Now, I have to say again that the way in which this has been reported in the West has been astonishing There have been one or two minor critiques. There's been some rather mumbled words of, well, criticism. Well, I don't think they're anywhere near strong enough from the Pope. But generally speaking, most of the media reporting that I've seen of this attempt to seize control of the Lavra and to expel the monks in the West has been supportive of what the Ukrainian government has been doing. We've been reading things like, that the Lavra is a center of Russian activity or even of spying, which I have to say, given that it's a monastic building, does seem a rather far-fetched idea. I would also say, by the way, that when it comes to monks in the past, during the Second World War, Western pilots who were shot down, especially over Italy, sometimes did find refuge in monastic institutions, Catholic monastic institutions. And, well, the fact that they were there was pretty much known to the Italian and German authorities, but they showed some understanding of the fact that it would at least be open them to criticism if they entered those monastic institutions, which as a result preserved themselves. But in Ukraine, apparently, the Ukrainian government is able to enter monastic institutions, try to drive out the monks, and it comes in for very little criticism indeed. Now, I am, by practice and belief, an Orthodox Christian. I found this a very difficult story, so difficult that I have, up to now, avoided discussing it. So I'm not going to say much more, other than to say that those who are sitting back, letting this happen, perhaps quietly cheering it on, well, I leave it to them to decide for themselves how that is consistent with their principles and beliefs and consciences. Anyway, let's move on and to talk about other things. Now, there's been a certain amount of news on the economic front. I say a certain amount of news, a very important piece of news, actually, which is that a group of major oil producers, led by Saudi Arabia, have now also announced significant cuts in oil production. Saudi Arabia announced a unilateral cut of oil production of 500,000 barrels a day. Various other Gulf producers have joined, so have some of the Central Asian states. I expect that there will be, before long, a full decision by OPEC backing an earlier decision by Russia also to cut oil production. And this is, in aggregate, going to be a significant cut in oil production of, well over 1 million barrels a day. And already it's had an effect on oil prices, which have been pushing upward. Now, the price of oil has been sliding in recent weeks, but I think most people expect that if the West avoids recession, which I have to say is doubtful, but most people think that if the West avoids recession, with the Chinese economy now firing on all cylinders, there's been a marked expansion in the Chinese economy over the last few months since China fully reopened after the pandemic, after its pandemic restrictions. Most people had been expecting that oil prices would go up anyway. So why have the Saudis done this? Well, I think that there is a very straightforward explanation. And I think, by the way, it goes to the core of the collapse in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And I think what has infuriated the Saudis is that the United States, or at least the Biden administration, is still making efforts to push down oil prices. And it's doing so through various means. Firstly, there were those oil price caps that were imposed on Russian oil products that came into force earlier this year, these G7 caps. And then there were the releases from the United States' strategic reserve, which President Biden has been undertaking ever since oil prices started to rise. And he's continuing to do it. He's been doing it even when oil prices have fallen back. He's still releasing oil from the United States' strategic reserve, even though that has now become depleted to the levels that it last had in the mid to early 1980s. And I think that the Saudis, who are, of course, one of the three major oil producers and also one of the two key oil exporters, are not happy with the fact that the United States is trying to control and push downward the price of their product. And I think that more than any other single thing, it is this policy of the Biden administration to interfere in the oil market, to try to push prices down when they go up, and even more outrageously, to push prices further down when they go down, which explains the antagonism between Saudi Arabia and the Biden administration that has emerged over the last few months. And I get to say further that I think that this has united the Saudi princes behind the Crown Prince, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, who's not always had an easy relationship with some of the Saudi princes until now, and who also, however, has had his own personal reasons, going back to the Khashoggi affair, of being less than sympathetic to liberal opinion in the United States and to the Biden administration in particular. So it is, again, very extraordinary that the United States, or at least the Biden administration, seems blind to this reality, that they don't seem to grasp that taking this action of trying constantly to push down oil prices is inevitably going to sour the US relationship with its key Arab ally. Its key ally, not just in the Middle East, but historically, going all the way back to the 1970s, in balancing the oil market, keeping oil prices under control, and also buttressing the reserve currency status of the dollar. It's, again, I can't help but think, a further example of the way in which the Biden administration is overwhelmingly focused on two things. Firstly, on trying to hurt Russia by trying to artificially push down oil prices. The Biden administration, I think, continues to believe that Russia is just a gas station masquerading as a country, and that if oil prices fall far enough, that will somehow bankrupt Russia and prevent Russia from continuing its operation in Ukraine. I think that's one obsession. And I think the other obsession is that the United States, the Biden administration, is more than almost any other administration I have known, determined to preserve itself politically, worried very much about the risk of a return to power by the Republicans and indeed by Donald Trump. And as a result, it's anxious to keep oil prices down, even as it continues its sanctions policy against Russia. So I think that in all of this, the administration is showing utter blindness to Saudi concerns. And I think that this is now starting to have a practical effect. We see the Saudis now completing a major package of agreements with China, economic agreements with China. They've agreed to re-establish diplomatic relations with Iran. They let the Chinese broker a rapprochement between themselves and Iran. They are now apparently intending to invite the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad to the next Arab League summit meeting, thereby fully reintegrating Syria into the Arab world. Taking all of these steps, but most importantly, and above all else, they're now increasingly shifting away from their historic position of only selling oil for dollars. So they've done deals with China. Apparently, they're in the process of negotiating a similar huge deal with India. They will sell in India oil in return for payment in rupees. And that's Indian currency, rupees. And of course, the Russians are doing the same. They're selling India oil for rupees. The ruble-rupee trade is now up and running. And of course, with Saudi Arabia gradually integrating itself into the Eurasian system, it's joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a kind of candidate member. It's apparently intending to join the BRICS. I can't help but think that all of these arrangements to accept payments in national currencies are preparatory. They form a transitional phase before the introduction of the BRICS reserve currency, in which the Saudis obviously want to play a role. So all of this is going on, and the Saudis, instead of perhaps being wary of it, as they might have been in former times when they were the US's ally, they're now embracing it. They are actively helping all of these countries, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, all the rest. They're pressing on with helping these countries in setting up this alternative trading and currency architecture independent of and separate from the dollar. And this last decision, as I said, to cut oil production is just another example of this. Now, on the topic of oil, I think that it's now becoming increasingly clear as well that we are looking at essentially a disintegrated oil market. And what's becoming very interesting is that today, another big Asian economy basically announced or confirmed that it was breaking away from the United States in terms of the oil sanctions policy that has been imposed on Russia. And that economy, that country, is Japan. Now, Japan is a member of the G7. As a member of the G7, it was one of the countries that formally agreed to Janet Yellen's oil price cap idea last autumn. I was always skeptical about the viability of the oil price cap. It's clear that it has never had much traction on Asian markets. Japan, which is a major economy in the Asian system, has decided that it has to import oil and gas from Russia. There's no option but to do that in order to sustain its economic viability. And it has informed the United States that it is going to buy oil from Russia above the cap. In other words, it's opted out of the G7 oil price cap. And apparently, the Japanese told the United States that that was what they were going to do. But in order to try to sugar the pill, or soften the blow, if you like, it was agreed that this would be done face-saving, but through a face-saving formula. The United States and the other G7 states would grant Japan a waiver from the oil price cap. Japan would be able to buy oil from Russia above the oil price cap, and the United States and the other G7 states would allow it to do so. Now, what that means is that the other big Asian economy, the three biggest Asian economies are China, India, and Japan. All three of these Asian economies are now buying oil and gas from Russia, and they are not observing the oil price cap. There's another point to bear in mind as well. If we're talking about the G7, Japan, as a nation, as a state, has the biggest single economy in the G7 after the United States itself. So even within the G7, the second biggest economy has in effect defected from the United States over this issue of the oil price cap. The oil price cap is in effect collapsing. The US remains largely self-sufficient in oil, so it can just about get by, pretend to abide by it, and it's not unduly affected. The people who are continuing to observe this oil price cap are the European Union, except, of course, that even they are now buying oil from Russia at premium prices through third parties, and they know that they're doing it. Rarely has a policy failed so completely and so quickly. On the topic of Japan, I'm going to say something else. When Xi Jinping visited Moscow and had his big meeting with Vladimir Putin, creating what the British commentator and former diplomat Alistair Cook calls the new Entente. It's one way of describing this relationship between China and Russia. Why not, in fact? Anyway, whilst Xi Jinping was in Moscow, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, went off and had a meeting in Kiev with Zelensky. And of course, a lot of people, I remember, were saying, well, this is countering the moves that the Chinese were making. The Chinese are going to Moscow, but China's big Asian rival, it's going to Kiev instead. I think this revelation that the Japanese have just torn up the oil price gap provides us with a true explanation of why Kishida went to Kiev to meet Zelensky. I think he went to Kiev because this was part of the quid pro quo for the agreement, the agreement by the US and the other G7 for Japan, in effect, to walk out of the oil price cap. The Japanese said, well, if you let us get out of this cap, we're going to do all kinds of nice things for you. We'll give you more support for Taiwan and all that sort of thing. And we're going to go to Kiev as well. And we're going to meet Zelensky. And we're going to have a meeting there. We'll be there before the cameras. So Xi Jinping will be in Moscow meeting Putin, but we will be in Kiev meeting Zelensky. And I think that was the explanation for that really rather strange visit, which, to be honest, I couldn't really make very much sense of. Well, money talks. Sometimes it talks more loudly than words do. Sometimes very much more loudly. And we see that in this particular case, Japan has talked more loudly with its money than it did with its words. Because, of course, even as Japan, as its Prime Minister, went to Kiev, it was agreeing to buy oil from the Russians at a price higher than the oil price cap. I would just say this. Prime Minister Kishida does need to be very careful about visiting Kiev and appearing to get too close to Zelensky. My colleague and friend at the Duran, Alex Christoforou, has coined the expression the Zelensky, or he prefers to say the Elensky curse. Anybody, any political leader who gets too close to President Zelensky, let's say, has a drastically shortened, or appears to have a drastically shortened political life. So we've seen Boris Johnson of Britain, he's no longer Prime Minister. Draghi of Italy has also gone. All sorts of other people have gone as well. And now, of course, the Prime Minister of Finland, Prime Minister Marin, who, of course, was the person who committed Finland 100%, 150% to support for Ukraine, who reversed Finland's historic and once popular and extremely successful policy of neutrality, who reversed and ended Finland's formerly close and even friendly relations with its giant neighbour, Russia. Anyway, Prime Minister Marin has just lost an election in Finland in which she came third. Well, she's apparently still personally popular, and it was a very hard-fought election, and the three parties, of which, as I said, her party came third. Well, if you look at the actual votes, the number and percentage of the votes, they're all very close to each other. So saying that her party came third is perhaps a bit hard. But nonetheless, the fact is, she's not going to be Prime Minister of Finland. And one wonders whether perhaps that's something which others might want to take cognizance of before they get too close to Zelensky in Kiev. One other person might be starting to worry about the same thing, and that is Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission. Now, I believe she still has some time still as President of the European Commission, but reports were circulating yesterday that she's now decided to move from her office in one building in Brussels to an office in another building in Brussels. She has decided, apparently, to apply for the post of Secretary General of NATO. Now, there's some scepticism about whether she'll get it. The British apparently are unhappy because they feel that she was an utterly incompetent defense minister in Germany who allowed the German military to run down to the deplorable state that it's in. Though it must be said, bad defense minister though she was only the latest in a succession of German defense ministers who've allowed that particular situation to arise. But anyway, it seems that the British are sceptical, but it also seems that there is a possibility that she might get the role, because apparently, though the British are sceptical and unhappy, they're not prepared to veto her if the other NATO countries support her nomination. And the person who for a while appeared to be the front runner, Chrystia Freeland of Canada, is now said to be, for reasons I don't know and don't understand, but she's said to be unacceptable to the United States. The US has apparently signalled that it doesn't want to see Chrystia Freeland as NATO Secretary General. So it could be that Ursula von der Leyen has concluded that it may be less than a good idea to remain President of the European Commission for much longer, and so she's decided to transfer to the safer post, which is Secretary General of NATO instead. Maybe she too fears the onset of the Zelensky curse and is looking for a bolt hole before it comes. Just guessing. Who's to say? Anyway, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Lots of things obviously going on the Ukrainian battlefronts. No doubt there'll be more information about the Tatarsky murder as well. And in the meantime, all that remains is for me to wish all of you a good day and to remind you that you can find all our videos on our various channels, or platforms rather, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram, that you can also support our work by going to Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day.